looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. There's a lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you. I know that life outside is so hard. There's a lot of things that can tear you apart. I know the roads sometimes feel lonely, but remember you're not the one and only. There's always someone there to help you, a helping hand to pull you through. There's only one thing you should do: take my hand and join the Love and Laugh crew. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then that love and life guide you.
Wynand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world, and welcome to tonight's live stream. Well, tonight I talked to Senior Freedom Front Plus Member of Parliament, Dr. Wynand Boshoff, regarding topical issues facing all South Africans. These include Eskom and load shedding, food security, and the brewing controversy over unisex toilets in public schools. This last topic was recently raised in Australia and immediately shut down because of public outrage. Let's have a listen to that.
I think this is a lovely experiment to see how it goes.
Yeah, I think I'd rather stick with the girls' toilets instead.
Fortitude Valley State Secondary College isn't open yet, but has already caused controversy, announcing it will be the first school in Queensland to have gender-neutral toilets.
The school outlined plans to have lockable floor-to-ceiling cubicles, each with a basin, except for 2 male-female toilets in dedicated change rooms.
The Premier found out through media this morning, quickly shutting it down.
I'll be making it very clear they need to have toilets that are for boys and for girls.
The opposition agrees.
It's deeply concerning to think that a 12-year-old girl would be in a bathroom with a 17-year-old.
Psychologists
Hello,
suggest
Scott.
giving it a try.
Well, the power is back, so we are running.
Okay, could you just hold it there? I'm just
Some
doing the
parents
intro.
agree.
Everyone has a right to choice, I guess, and it's moving forward and it's the way forward.
Others
Just
are
stay
yet to
online,
be
that's good.
convinced.
Yeah, I think I like
That's right,
female
yes.
toilets because they're a bit cleaner.
The school will open next year with or without unisex bathrooms. Amelia Radham, 7 News.
All right, guys. Sorry about that. I just got Wynand joining us, and I just need to sort out a couple of things here. There we go. Right. Okay. Now, Wynand, you are here with us, so let's get the show on the road.
Yeah, that's a good thing to do.
Good to see you, mate. Good to see you. It's been a while, hasn't it?
Yeah, it feels like old acquaintance, but time goes faster than one thinks.
Yeah, it does. It does. And look, we've had you on live streams a few times now, and it's always a pleasure having you on. And tonight we're talking about some very serious issues, and they cover a wide range of topics. But let's get straight into this, and we'll start off with the issues related to Eskom and then food security, and then move on to this ridiculous suggestion that there should be unisex toilets in South Africa. I know that's a completely different subject, but it's a very important one. Now, let's get into Eskom. How does the problem at Eskom, above everything else, impact on diesel reserves in South Africa?
Yeah, there are two ways in which it has an impact on food security. But let's go to the diesel first. About half of Eskom's installed ability in terms of coal-powered power stations don't work. Not the same half all the time, but about the half normally doesn't work. So in peak times, there has to be something as a backup. Now, Eskom always used to have these open-cycled gas generators, but it's not gas, it's diesel. So I believe that diesel is gasified before it's used. I don't exactly know how those work. But the whole idea is that if there is a sudden drop in power, this can be started up very quickly, and it can just breach the gap. But this isn't its function anymore. These generators are running full-time, nearly full-time. For the year of 2022, 12 billion rand was budgeted for diesel.
Wow.
And one of the problems is that's basically been used up. So 12 billion rand, to put it into perspective, the whole Department of Science and Innovation in South Africa has a little bit more than 10 billion rand to work with. The FNB Stadium in Pretoria, in Johannesburg, actually in Soweto, I heard today, would in today's terms cost something like 6 billion rand. So in 1 year, double of that has been burnt in the form of diesel. And we know, due to international circumstances, there is a limited supply of diesel. So it's something like a perfect storm, not yet perfect. There are a few things that can still go wrong, which hasn't or haven't. But it takes a huge amount of diesel out of the market. And of course, we are in planting time at the moment. The whole agricultural sector is also heavy on diesel. All the big tractors, the combine harvesters for the wheat harvest, which has to come off, and in the summer rainfall areas, it's time to plant maize. So South Africa has also lost about half of its refinery capacity. So in the olden days, it was easier to breach a supply problem because we had lots of tanks to store up crude oil and to produce diesel, petrol, aviation fuel from that. But now about 60% of our fuel needs are imported in the completed form. So we are incessantly competing with all the world for the capacity which is available on a global scale.
Wow. Well, look, I was just reading tonight that they caught this guy who was a contractor working at one of the ESCOM outfits, actually sabotaging. And I'll be putting a video up about that later. And this is happening all the time. You've got these contractors who come in, and this is why there is so much trouble at ESCOM at the moment. And talking about fuel, I heard it was 80% of South Africa's fuel production has been destroyed because of fuel processing plants closing down. I think there's only Sasol left.
Yes, Sasol has a stake in both the refineries which are left. The one is at Sasol 2 at Secunda, and the other one is the Natref plant, which I think is near Sasol 1, Sasolburg. So there are 2 refinery plants. South Africa used to be able to produce about 90% of its own usage. It's down to 40% now. So there are other problems also. Diesel has to be much cleaner than it used to be. And our facilities came from a different era. And it's also part of this whole thing of not investing in the future. One could still go running on the old facilities, but in Arabia they put up these huge facilities, and it seems to be uneconomical to either retrofit your own facilities or to really build new ones. So it is part of the time of globalization, which has been a little bit relativized, in recent times, with people realizing it is good to be self-sufficient to some measure. But it was very much in vogue at a certain time to say, why would you make anything yourself that you can buy on the international market for a good price? So in this case, it was not state-driven, other than the electricity crisis. These were just companies making choices which seemed to be rational to them. But where the state could come in, and the good minister of energy could have guided this process, is to say, okay, no, we need a fuel master plan, and we will assist in keeping up the facility. So the one closed down because it was not efficient anymore. The other one burned down, and then they decided not to rebuild it. And in the end, we just have Sasol, which has the ability to really produce clean petrol and diesel, and then the Natref facility, which is also relatively well.
Yeah, I guess the thing or the message I take away from this, Wynand, is that if it wasn't for diesel and the ability to use diesel to produce electricity, South Africa would be in the dark now.
Exactly. We would have something like half of the day with power and other half of the day without. These open cycle generators really play a central role. And one can't even say, well, let's just turn off the electricity for a while so that we can get the next harvest in on the lands or in the fields, because a very important part of South Africa's grain harvest is irrigated. Not just the grain, of course, basically 100% of the fruit, which earns a hell of a lot of foreign money, valuta, for the country. So electricity is essential for that. There's no way in which to say, let's just get by without electricity for a while without putting into danger food security. So South Africa is like a guy who earns just about enough money that if he borrows a little bit every month, he can get along. But then his car mustn't break, or the fridge mustn't, something mustn't happen to the fridge. Nothing must go wrong. That's where South Africa is at the moment, and things really tend to go wrong when you are in such a situation.
Wow. And you know, the odds against or odds for something going wrong in a big way are getting bigger and bigger and bigger as the days go by. We see that. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I've listened to Jan Oberholzer, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Eskom, and he said that was exactly the strategy, let's say some 7-8 years ago at Eskom, to say, well, let's run these coal-fired stations flat out and make sure that we have some electricity in the economy. So it's a very short-term solution, and if you look at the graphs, it kind of worked. There was a time, I think around 2015, 16, 17, where there was an increased availability of electricity. But that is a little bit like noticing that your car has problems, and then you say, okay, let's drive at 160 and let's see if we can get home. The only problem with this is you never get home because there always need to be electricity. Not going to get to the point that you can say, we're done, we made it.
Well, let's face it, forward thinking and maintenance are not the strong suits of the ANC cadres who are running these state-owned enterprises, and that speaks for itself. Now, what actually complicates the situation, Wynand, is that South Africa has got no oil reserves. So why are people surprised that the country is an importer of the three major fuels, which is obviously a huge burden on the balance of trade or the balance of the economy?
Yes, I think if we take a step back, one could say the economy is actually, it mirrors the amount of energy used, not really the amount of money, because you can increase the money supply and then you just get inflation. But if you increase the usage of energy, then you have growth. And South Africa, when it became a union in 1910, and especially in 1924, when General Hertzog came to power with the slogan of South Africa First, it said, okay, so we don't have oil. What are we going to do? We are going to do everything with coal that one can do with coal, and then a bit. And we are going to enhance our ability to process crude oil. So crude oil is relatively easy, it's easy to import and to store, and much less volatile than the final products, especially petrol and aviation fuel. So we built up this ability, and even in the 1950s, Sasol was started with a process which people said never can be done economically. It's technically a possibility, but not a commercial possibility. And in the end, Sasol proved it all wrong. And we got used to this idea of actually being an oil importer, but a fuel exporter. So we supplied all the countries around with fuel because we had the facilities to do so. Okay, but that's something of the history now. All we have left is Sasol, and one just wants to ask yourself what would have been the situation in South Africa now if the government in the 1950s did not have the foresight to start with Sasol.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. About a month ago, I had a live stream with Rob Hersoff, who's a billionaire living in Cape Town. And he mentioned that his grandfather was actually instrumental in actually setting up Sasol back then.
Yeah, I think it's one of the major achievements of the previous century.
Yeah.
And people who invested it when it was privatized, I think they are very glad about it now. Sasol also had the hiccup or two on its way. But it's by and large, I think, a good company. And at the moment, it is diversifying into hydrogen, especially in the Northern Cape, where it is possible to produce green hydrogen. And that is their decarbonization strategy, is to say, okay, we are going to make the fluid fuels from hydrogen and not only from coal anymore. Of course, it will be a transition. And I would not like to be a coal basher, if I could call it like that. Contrary to what many other people believe, I actually think that climate change is human-induced. I believe that the scientific evidence, to my mind, points towards it. I know there are some people who differ, but that doesn't mean that one would say people should have known better in the 50s or the 60s or whatever. And nobody thought about the idea that an increased level of carbon dioxide will create an increased what do you call it, greenhouse effect on the Earth's atmosphere. And I just think the previous generations did tremendously by harnessing the sources that we have had in those days. Of course, there's also the possibility of shale gas in the Karoo, which to my mind is a little bit of a problem because the whole process of fracking will most probably not be good for the water which is available in the area. And it's one of those things that if you make a slight error and you do pollute the water despite all the promises, there's nothing to replace it. One can turn something, an area where, let's say a marginal economy is still possible, one can turn into a complete wasteland. So the problem is, what are we going to do with energy? Maybe there are some gas reserves off the South African coast, but then also there's pressure not to use that because of the ecological sensitivity. My information is that there are proven gas reserves for about 50 years on a global scale.
Wow.
And I believe in those 50 years, maybe another technological breakthrough will come along.
Well, look, I just want to address the issue of that gas which is off the coast at East London that Shell were looking for, and apparently it's a huge amount of it. The problem we have now in Australia is that all our oil and gas is owned by US-based mining companies, and all operating on Wall Street. And our electricity here in Australia is going to be going up by 65% in December.
Sure.
65%, because we are paying market prices for gas to run the power stations, which means that there's a huge rise in the cost of actually producing electricity, which is absolutely crazy, because the gas is actually being mined here in Australia by a company that's based on Wall Street, and they're charging us market prices which are way off the scale because of what's happening in Ukraine. And the gas is now being sold by European countries. So our gas, we are having to pay top prices for, which is impacting every single person in this country. And yet it's been mined here in Australia. I mean, it is crazy. The lesson I think that should be learned by South Africa is that the government should actually go and find that gas off East London. They should actually have you don't want the ANC doing this because they will screw it up. But if the Freedom Front Plus were, let's say, in power, they could go and basically mine that gas, have it coming into South Africa, and then sell it at a discounted price. Cut out the bloody capitalist sector altogether, because it's a critical entity, just like water. You know, it is that critical. Over to you.
No, I agree. It's an interesting thing. The whole idea of state-owned enterprises, one's attitude towards that depends on whether you trust the government or not.
No, you don't.
In the olden days, I mean, people who are now committed free market people saw no problem with Sasol, Eskom, Iscor being the property of the state, because those people trusted the government at this stage, and I also think, those companies really benefited the economy together with Transnet. The whole South African modernization was built, of course, in the first place on the gold mines and the rest of the mining sector, but we could have been just an extractive economy like many other African economies, which really never developed to a sophisticated first world economy. And this whole concerted project of saying, okay, the different networks, the road network, the rail network, the power network, and then also the usage of our own resources, with iron ore being processed in Vanderbijlpark and Newcastle and Pretoria. That created a basis on which a sophisticated economy could grow. And even when some of those didn't perform like they used to, the economy was resilient because there was much more to the economy than just extraction. Now we have a state that we do not trust with that, and I'm not even sure if their own supporters trust them with it. Well, that's part of the problem. I just wanted to refer to that thing that you said about selling your own products, petrol and diesel or gas, against market-related prices. That is one of the ironical things about Sasol, that the petrol price is everywhere the same. You don't pay less for Sasol than for any other imported petrol. Of course, it would be very difficult if that would be a cost-related price, then all the Sasol petrol would always be done.
Yeah.
And the others would have been bought afterwards. So we have a regulated market for fuel in South Africa. And it means that if you want to benefit, you have to buy Sasol shares. Because whenever the petrol price rises, the costs don't rise, but the income does. So it's a little bit unlogical, but that's the way it is.
Yeah. Now, just talking about this trusting the government, in 2008, they sold the strategic oil reserve in South Africa. Does that have anything to do with the present shortages of diesel?
No, as a matter of fact, it does not. What happened at that stage is it was a paper transaction. The strategic reserve was sold to some of the big mining companies who would have used it in their own way, which I'm not exactly sure what they planned to do with it. But then the whole transaction was taken to the court, and it was reversed there. So the money went back from the state to the companies, and the certificates, the ownership certificates, went back from the companies to the state. So that doesn't have anything to do with it. That oil didn't go anywhere. And it was early enough that not a drop of it was used before the transaction was reversed. But the problem is that, if you have personal savings or an inheritance or something, it's very easy to take every month just a little bit out of the inheritance to add to the running expenses in a family's life. And then at one pretty day you see, okay, my whole inheritance is done now. I've consumed it all.
Yeah.
And that's basically what happened to that strategic reserve, which still existed until rather recently.
Right. Now, I just want to change tack a little bit. We'll come back to the food security issue in a second, but I just made a couple of notes here while we were talking, and I find it quite ironic that when Ramaphosa gets up and has his family meetings where he talks to everybody and he says, for example, South Africa is well placed to take advantage of the developments in the fourth industrial revolution, and then goes on to talk about smart cities. I mean, what land does this guy live on? Because if they can't even provide electricity, how is that going to work in those scenarios? It can't. It's absolutely crazy. And yet now they're talking about unisex toilets in schools as if that's a huge priority. These guys have got it completely screwed up, haven't they?
Yes, I believe they do. South Africa, you could say several countries in one. On the one hand, you have a sophisticated first world economy. And if Mr. Ramaphosa speaks about smart cities and stuff, then it's not going to be really done by the state. It's going to be done by the private sector. And that is what makes South Africa different from other African countries, that there's really a dedicated private sector who says we're not going anywhere. Despite all the immigration and those big numbers who do leave the country, there are still many who don't. And those people want to stay, abreast with all new developments, and those are the guys who are doing fourth industrial revolution kind of things, artificial intelligence, which is developed, and so on. The state has very little to do with it. The best it can do is to ensure that we have bandwidth, which is a problem. But if we go to the toilets now, it is as if the government, especially the Department of Basic Education, likes to think of South Africa as part of the vanguard of, the most recent intellectual schools of thought in the world. So let's say in the queue of really pioneers, you get Finland and Switzerland and Singapore and South Africa. While we still have pit toilets in many of our schools, and we have many schools who just don't get the basic things right. They don't get their teachers at school on time. They don't keep their teachers there the whole time. And now they have this idea, part of the human rights culture is that, let me just get that whole word, the socio-educational inclusion of diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, expression and sex characteristics, SOGSC, in schools. So I went to YouTube because this SOGSC stuff, I wondered, do you say SOGISC or SOGISC or whatever, but then I learned it is SOGSC.
Right.
Okay. So this is the newest thing in the Western world. We thought that the Bill of Rights saying there may not be discriminated against anybody about, religion, sexual identity, language, race, anything. That would mean that if you refuse a transgender boy or girl, doesn't matter, access to a school because of its sex, that would be discrimination. So we also, okay, no, we won't do that. But now it's taken a little bit further. It's a little bit like a treadmill. Once you get on it, it gets a life of its own. So now that's not enough anymore. If I was born as John, but I decided at the age of 12 or 13 that I'm actually a girl and I want to be Janine now, and you call me John at school, you're the teacher and you call me John, then I'm highly offended. Then you are discriminating against me. And if I want to play netball with the girls, or hockey, or whatever, or run against them in long distance and whatever, and they say I may not because actually I'm a boy, then I'm highly offended, and that can't be. So together with several other first world countries, and as a matter of fact, with the financial aid from international aid institutions from Belgium and Germany, and also from the Human Rights Commission of South Africa, some 30 million rand was spent on developing these guidelines. Now, the guidelines is a little booklet of about 23 pages. It looks like that.
That costs
I
30
don't know
million
how
rand.
pardon?
That costs 30 million rand.
Yes, unless, they have already prepared all the learning material. We also saw electronic versions of a teacher guide for preschool gender inclusion. Now, I'm asking myself, how on earth or why on earth would you do it at a preschool level?
Yeah.
But apparently it's very important. What I suspect is that the stuff is printed and it stands in boxes ready in storerooms to be distributed to schools. We got this document, which is now called the discussion document, and I brought it to the public attention in Parliament, referring to the document, saying, okay, we would really like to know what the status of this is. And when the Deputy Minister had the opportunity to respond, she did not. So we assumed that our information that it will be implemented in South African schools January 2023 was actually the truth. So we went to the media with it, and I distributed photographs of every page of this to several journalists, and this also got a life of its own. People started to see that. All that people actually focus on is this toilet story. But it's not just about toilets, it's toilets too. It's to say, okay, you don't want to single out the transgender learner. So there shouldn't be boys' toilets and girls' toilets and other toilets. There should just be toilets, because otherwise you are going to draw attention to the boy who goes to the unisex toilets. So there must be just toilets. And then each toilet room or building must consist of a lot of cubicles where every child can do his ablution or her ablution and put on sport clothes or whatever you do in a cloakroom and a toilet in its own little space where they can't be molested by anybody else. Now, if you've ever heard of a nightmare for the prevention of gender-based violence, I think this is it. But as we had the light of day shining upon this document, and it was, very well publicized, the Department of Basic Education came with a statement today to say, no, this is not guidelines like in guidelines. This is just a very early discussion document. So we said, okay, that's fine. One needs to backtrack in a way in which you don't lose face. So I have a little bit of a giggle about it that we published a statement saying, okay, we welcome the downgrade of this to a discussion document. And many people just see this thing, the Freedom Front welcomes this. Say, how can you welcome that? No, we don't. We are glad that it's not a policy document anymore. It's just a so-called discussion document, because that is the only way that the state can get out of it without saying, listen, guys, we made an error, or we wanted to surprise you next year and say, voila, here's a nice gender policy for you all to implement. So, of course, they don't want to say that. So they say it's a discussion document and we're glad about it.
Well, look, I just want to say that the fact that they spent 30 million rand on what they're now calling a discussion document, when they can't afford to pay for the most basic things in hospitals, shows that these guys are completely clueless. I've seen photos in hospitals where the roofs are leaking in the operating theaters because they can't afford to get that fixed. I mean, these guys have got no ideas on priorities, have they?
There's a problem with ring-fenced monies, because, this certain aid organization, I forgot its name, it's of the Flemish part of Belgium. They gave a certain amount, and it is especially for this. So it would be irregular expenditure to use that to repair a clinic, for instance. Or some German institution also gave an undisclosed amount. So we don't know exactly how much. But it is exactly as you say. We have clinics, we have gender-based violence in schools, normal, let's forget about the word normal, with a binary sexual or gender identification of boys and girls. We have girls who are raped by boys. And it's serious, and it should be, addressed urgently. But now we are focusing on this. I think, it's this kind of international agenda on human rights, and which is imposed on us as an African country. And what I don't understand is that a government who prides itself on its post-colonialist approach will take this money from all the old colonial funders and follow a social agenda which was not devised in Africa. No African solutions for African problems, but Dutch or Flemish solutions for African problems. It's silly. I don't know exactly where they think they are, but it's not going to work here with us. So in South Africa, we have a public school system as opposed to a state school system. That's one of the advantages after 1994. Before 1994, we had state schools, and the state decided everything in those schools. Now we have public schools, and that was, in fact, part of the settlement of 1994, that the old government promised to the white voters own residential areas and own schools. They couldn't deliver on the residential areas naturally, but in a sense they delivered on the schools by saying, okay, schools are going to be public schools, and they're going to be governed by school governing bodies, and those bodies will be constituted out of parents. Always more than 50% of the members will be parents, and then also teachers and other non-academic workers in school. They will all together form the school governing body, and they will decide on how the school is governed, the language of learning and instruction, the religion policy, the admission policy. All that the state would do is to pay one teacher for every 35 children or learners, and to determine the curriculum documents, the hard contents. So you could say that everything that you learn that stands in books is determined by the state, but everything you learn by living will be determined by the school governing body. And the state wants to encroach on this right. So there's a basic education laws amendment bill in front of Parliament at the moment, which wants to shift most of these important decisions to the head of the provincial education department. And exactly at the same time, incidentally, we find these guidelines, of which SGBs all, of course, can say, no, we don't want to implement it, but there will be pressure on them to do so. So now it's clear. We say, do you really want this department to have more authority on your school, or would you rather want them to have less and the community more? So in a sense, I would say it's a blessing in disguise. Let us really see what the state's educational agenda is, and we can decide if we want that to realize in our schools.
I just want to make a couple of comments about what you were just saying. The first thing is you talked about the international agenda. And if you look at the agenda of the World Economic Forum, one of their key agendas is to de-sex people. And what I mean by that is for people to lose their manhood and their womanhood. In other words, they all become its. And the reason they want to do that is because that breaks up the family unit. Now, if you look at what they're doing by bringing in decentralized sex education into schools in South Africa from the age of 5, where boys are told it's okay to be like a girl, and girls are being told it's okay to be like a boy. So little boys might go and play with dolls, and little girls might go and play rugby with the boys. This is what has been pushed into the minds of kids who still don't even understand that there is a difference between being a boy and a girl. And now they're putting on top of that this thing that if you say something nasty against a transgender person, the ramifications to you are huge, personally. So what they're actually doing, and I read a very interesting article about this. What they're actually doing is kids who feel like they're being bullied, kids who've got ADHD, kids who feel out of place at school, they're all going to take the easy option out by saying, I'm a boy, I'm going to pretend I'm a girl now, because then they can't touch me, then they can't bully me. And this is they're saying this is the huge danger of this whole thing, because kids that age, they'll be looking for an easy way out of stopping the bullying. So the thing they should actually be doing at schools is tackling the problem of bullying, tackling the problem of kids feeling out of it, and not putting this option in the place, which means that because they're now suddenly a girl where they used to be a boy, nobody can ever say anything to them, because now they're a protected species. This is crazy, and this is happening before our eyes. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting perspective on it as a way to get out of that space of being bullied. I want to say several things about this. The one thing is, I admit that the whole thing about gender is maybe a little bit more complicated than I used to think. I mean, there are more things to it, and we have something like the great Dr. James Barry, who was a medical pioneer in South Africa, and when he died, it was found that he was actually a woman. And it was in the late 19th century, so it wasn't socially acceptable for a woman to become a doctor, and she just pretended to be a man for the rest of her life. And the nationalist leader, General Hertzog, James Barry Minnock Hertzog, he got his name from that Dr. Barry. So there's something to it, but it's still the exception. And one should not treat the exception as if it's the rule, and the rule as if it's the exception. Every one of us as an individual at some times feel excluded, and as if you don't really fit in. And then it's easy to say, okay, I'm bullied because whatever, or as you said, I like baking cakes, and the other boys laugh at me because they don't like to bake cakes. So then I say, okay, but I'm actually a girl. To my mind, and the way in which I grew up, as brothers and sisters, there were not, gender assigned tasks. Boys had to do stuff that the girls had to do, and other way around. So it's not a kind of a rigid thing. One acknowledges that, but to say, if you reach 16, the old song said, "Sweet 16 and never been kissed."
Yeah.
Now, if you are a sweet 16 and you never thought you were actually a boy when you were born a girl, or other way around, then it seems that you are actually a little bit stupid. Don't you think about this stuff? I always think about the rainbow, the old story that if you walk under the rainbow, you'll become a girl. So yes, like I spent some thought about that when I was little. That would be very interesting, but it didn't mean I was gender.
I never heard that
word?
one.
No. Yeah, it's an old story that you will pick up the other sex if you pass under the rainbow. So, but I wasn't gender confused. That's a word.
Yeah.
And I actually think that you create confusion where there is not, by telling children,
Exactly.
okay, think about this, think about that.
The problem is, it's the age that they start this shit. I mean, if it was a kid who's like 16 and they started saying, and specifically for kids who appear to have a leaning towards the other sex. I could understand that, but to try and indoctrinate kids that are 5 and 6 years old, suggesting that they might be a girl when they're a boy. I mean, that all that does is confuses the shit out of these little kids. And you can understand why the world is becoming such a basket case.
Yes. Yes, no, so that's why I think you started off by by referring to the family.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the main things. The family is a cornerstone
Exactly.
of the community.
Yeah.
And the community is actually the building blocks of the state. And this is turned around now, not just now, it's an old thing, that the state tries to turn it around and say, okay, you've got the state, and then you have free atoms within this state, and those are individuals, and some individuals are incidentally in this family or in that family, and you can choose everything and anything. You can choose your name, you can choose your gender, you can repeatedly change the choice of your gender, you know. This year I'm a boy, next year I'm a girl again. It's a little bit of admin to go to Home Affairs. Sometimes I'm glad that Home Affairs in South Africa is so terribly inefficient, because at least it will make the fluidity of gender a little bit less. But in fact, it is silly. It's as you say, you understand that there are cases, and that should be dealt with empathy. Not by making somebody ridiculous, or making him into some kind of what's that word in Afrikaans? It's a frats, a freak. Making a freak of anybody who differs from the norm. But to actually say you are a freak if you identify according to the norm, that's a little bit what I think we are moving to.
Yeah. Now, look, I'm looking at the petition for from @change.org, no to unisex bathrooms for schools in South Africa. And right now, it's got nearly 75,000 signatures on it. And I'm just putting that on the screen for people to have a look at. And I'll put a link to this down below as well. And it's interesting, some of the comments that people have put in here. For example, Lamies Jacobs has written, I strongly disagree to unisex bathrooms, not because of transgender individuals, but because of all the other sick bastards who will be able to share bathrooms with innocent victims. Now, this is the overriding message I'm seeing from people, and it makes sense. Kids that age, they're always, let's say you've got a 13-year-old girl who goes into this unisex toilet, and you're followed by a 17-year-old boy. I mean, that's a disaster situation where you're putting them in a position where the girl can be compromised and the guy can take advantage of her. I mean, that is criminal.
Yes, exactly. So this whole thing is dealt with as if if you just say at assembly, listen. I wanted to say, listen, boys and girls, but you can't say that. Listen, learners, will all the sex predators remain in the hall when we all go to our classes? And then all the sex predators remain, and you tell them, okay, let's convince you to reconsider your choices. If you want to rape somebody, please do not do it in the bathrooms, because the bathrooms is supposed to be a safe space for learners of all genders. I mean, really.
It's just crazy.
You are dealing, the problem is not with the good children, the problem is with the guys with the sick, what's the word, leanings. And you are creating an opportunity for them.
They're predatory.
Yes, exactly. So it's a good idea. I just before we entered into this conversation, I was actually participating in the radio station, or the platform's name is Salam Media. It's a Muslim media platform,
right?
A little bit similar to yours. And they also discussed this thing, and they had somebody from the Department of Basic Education to explain what was the idea. And of course, it's predictable. It's saying, you have got these transgender children and other genders, and they don't feel safe. They are ridiculed in bathrooms and so on, and you have to work with it. And they say, so we are just discussing this. Now, okay, let's start the discussion, and let's do not do it in a way which makes the discussion polarized from the very beginning. But it is because we all suspect that if the government or the state is working on something and they don't play open cards, you ask themselves, okay, what are they up to? And I would really like to stay with my opinion, but I can only put it as an opinion, that I believe they wanted, in fact, to implement this as a surprise in the beginning of 2023. And that is what the 30 million rands was spent on, is to prepare the stuff that would have been implemented. And I think we stopped it for a while. It's exactly like the comprehensive sexual education that you mentioned a while ago. Yeah. That's also something that South Africa's Department of Basic Education had in mind. And sometimes I wonder even whether the Minister of Basic Education read this stuff. Because when she had to account in Parliament, she would say, well, of course we need sexual education, and then she would refer to all the GBV and all the pregnancies and backstreet abortions and stuff. And then they say, and then there are people who don't want us to call a butt a butt. They want us to call a butt a fleshy cushion on which you sit. But that was not what the CSE documents were about. And when the daylight shone upon what they, in fact, planned to implement, and that again was funded by a UN institutions. Again, something which was funded from abroad, not devised and conceptualized in South Africa, but rather just translated into our context. Then it was actually taken from nothing happened since, because the opposition was so really strong against it.
Well, look, I would put money on what I'm going to say now. I know this is a conspiracy theory, but I know this is what's happening. The people behind this are the Open Society Foundation. That's George Soros. And you'll find the people who've put that document together are tied up with Open Society Foundation, because they are central to destroying humanity as we know it. That's what they do. And they, sadly, a lot of the senior staff in Open Society Foundation are now advisors for members of parliament in South Africa. And that's a fact. You take Professor Ruth Hall, for example, who works at an organization called PLAS, which is funded by the Open Society Foundation, operates out of the University of Cape Town. You can actually go and look up her name at PLAS and you'll find her there. And she says that she is playing an instrumental role in establishing policy on the expropriation of land without compensation for the ANC government. This is happening in the background. This is not South Africans putting together this shit. This is people who are indoctrinated Americans, probably now working in South Africa, putting together documents like this, which are funded by other people from overseas. So what you've got is something that's been put together and just tabled by a completely clueless ANC minister as something that should be implemented by people who have absolutely no interest in South Africa or what's going on. They have their own agenda. Back to you.
Yeah, PLAS, just by the way, is at the University of the Western Cape, which is also in Cape Town, not the University of Cape Town. But it's exactly true about poverty, land, whatever the PLA stands for. But I think that is important to say that there's no such thing as a neutral social agenda or no social agenda. Yes, of course, I have a family value-based agenda. I really think that we would have a more stable society if we have happy families. And I think one of the big problems in South Africa is exactly the fact that less than half of children grow up in families with their biological mother and father as part of the family. And one is not just referring to certain segments of the demography, it's across the board that due to the pressures of present life, whatever, people get children and then they divorce, or they never marry and they get children. And children don't have the positive role model of a mother and a father, or even of other authoritative male and female figures in their life. And some are in families which are abusive. The answer to my mind is not to say, okay, so let's abolish the family and let's ask the state to take over the whole educational process because our families are useless in any case. No, the approach should be we should really rebuild our families as a foundation for basically everything. So that's a social agenda. I would never deny that. I have a clear social agenda in favor of the family and the community. Not just a nuclear family as an atom in the state, a family within a broader extended family with cousins and aunts and uncles and grandfathers and mothers and stuff, and then also the broader community. That is where stability comes from. And it's interesting, when this comprehensive sexual education was discussed in Parliament, it was also discussed because we discussed it. I mean, the department wasn't on its way to have it discussed in Parliament. We kept on asking questions, making statements and so on. And then in one speech, I specifically tried to look the ANC members in the eyes and say, this is what it's all about. You are parents and grandparents. Do you want this? Now, I don't want to take the credit for myself that it didn't become reality. It's just the fact that the real people, when they think about their own families, have clear references. It's one thing to be part of the ANC or whatever party with whatever its ideology is, but your family and your grandchildren or children, what do you want for them? And then it comes home a little bit.
I just want to say that it's so good that there's a major party in the government in South Africa, and that's Freedom Front Plus, who are taking a stand against this sort of crap. Because from what I can see, the Democratic Alliance are buying into it, and that's very, very sad.
Yeah, they have a difficult position in the sense that they are the classical liberals, and it's the liberal ideology, sliding towards this kind of thing. So the whole Bill of Rights. Now, I don't have anything against the Bill of Rights, but the Bill of Rights or the rights culture is creating this culture of entitlement, where a community-based approach, I think, is more appropriate, of course, with protecting the rights of individuals too. It's always this balance between the interests of the community and of the individual, that the one don't get in the shade of the other to the point that it doesn't grow. I participated in a discussion yesterday evening, and it was Reverend Kenneth Meshwe from the African Christian Democratic Party. They also have a very strong point on this. And then the Gauteng spokesperson for education from the DA and me. And the guy from the DA actually defended this document as he think it should have looked like. But it was clear to me that he has never read it.
Wow.
Because he said, such a document should say this and that, and then he defended that. But the document that he defended doesn't exist. So that's a problem. And I think one has to be clear about it. I think it's always this, that's the blind spot of liberals, to think that they are ideologically neutral. But there's no such thing as ideological neutrality. You believe in something, and one tends to want to promote that you believe in. So it's much better to be open about it and say, this is what I believe in, than to say, no, I just believe in science and in neutral values and in a better life for all. Well, it seems to be very neutral, but it's not.
Yeah, I just want to say on that point, Wynand, that Disney, we've all heard about Disney and these big parks they have. They're in a whole heap of trouble. And in fact, their share price is crashing because they embraced this whole thing with LGBTQ and all this sort of transgender shit. And 99% of families are against it. They don't want anything to do with it. And as a result, in America, a lot of families are staying away from the parks, staying away from the Disney Channel, because they've surreptitiously put little things in there too. And of course, this has caused billions of dollars of loss in the Disney organization because of the stand they took over this one issue. Now, the reason I'm raising this is because you mentioned the Constitution. The whole idea of justice is based on what the normal member of the community thinks. In other words, you don't do it based on what 1% of the community think. You do what 99% of the community think. And it's quite clear that when it comes to something like unisex toilets or pushing the CSE in schools to 5-year-olds, that's not what 99% want. So that's what the government should be standing up against, not embracing it.
Yes, and it's an attempt of changing the norms. An interesting state-induced changing of norms, which we witnessed since 1994, is something very different, and that is about smoking. People used to walk in the supermarket with a lit cigarette, and they would, tap down the ash in the aisle and whatever. It was just like that. And then the state came with draconian laws against it. Now, I've never been a smoker, so you won't find me complaining. But the norm went against that. People by themselves believe, okay, I should not smoke in, close proximity to other people unless they are smokers too. Now, that is something about health, and there are some objective evidence around that. But then you have something like family lives or gender or whatever, and they attempt to make something the norm, which is not the norm. And a whole deal of bullying is happening, I think, all over the world. Very few people really want to speak out against this because you are immediately labeled as some kind of, what's the word? You
transphobic.
That's right. And you don't want to accommodate other people. You are selfish and you are bad things. But you just don't spend your money the way you used to. And I think that's where they get it wrong. I didn't know that, what you said about Disney. I know that they have embraced this LGBTQI concept to a large extent, but I didn't know that they suffer losses because of that.
I can send you.
But that's exactly what happens.
I can send you the link. Now let's just move on to the final aspect of what we were talking about, and it's related to the diesel issue. And that is regarding food security in South Africa. Now, while we're sort of seeing the media sort of major in minors like this LGBTQ stuff, they're completely missing the point when it comes to food security, aren't they?
Yes, that's a problem if you attempt to be, like I said, in the row of countries like Finland and Sweden and the Netherlands and whatever,
Yeah.
but you can't even feed your people. And the problem is that South Africa today is, of course, much more market driven than it had been, not because of state ideology, but because of state inability. Everything that the state attempts to control, it loses control over because of the inability to do so. So the inequality in South Africa is increasing, and it will be increasing more, because it won't be that some people are richer and others are poorer. It will be that some will have abundance because they can afford it, and some will die from hunger. Now, that is a recipe for a powder cake. If you really have abundance and hunger to the level of people dying from it, it's, as somebody said, a hunger person doesn't have a conscience. You don't tell him he shouldn't do this or that. He's hungry. And it makes South Africa a very volatile country. Every decision, whether it is about whom we trade with, whether it is about what industries we protect or do not protect, if it comes down to the point of food security, one has a problem. Now, I once made the calculation. If you can maintain a growth rate of 7% per year, then within 14 years, you double the economy. Now, I understand the ANC's urge to transform the South African economy. Sorry, they want the workforce and the top levels of industry to reflect the power relation. That's that's a long way to say they want the people to be black, the managers and the bosses to be black. I understand that. As Afrikaners, when we took over government in 1948, we also had this. We wanted the civil service to be an Afrikaans civil service. At that time, it was easy. They said any person who wants to apply to the civil service had to be bilingual. And Afrikaners used to be more bilingual than English. So it was not affirmative action, but it worked a bit like it. But at least it was expected from everybody to be able to do his job. Except from being bilingual, you actually needed to be able to do your job. But if you could double the South African economy twice since 1994, just think of all the possibilities for transformation that would have created.
Absolutely.
The taxes that you can spend on bursaries for higher education, the way in which you could enhance the schools. You could even build unisex toilets, which would be safe, if you could double the economy twice in 28 years. But they rather select or choose to follow policies which cost the economy, which make the economy to contract year by year. Or to in relation to the population. I know there's still some economic growth, but if you look at the population growth, then we have a relatively contracting economy, and that is where the instability comes from. Don't need to be a sorcerer to know what it's heading to.
Yeah.
The question is, do we have the ability to stop it without the state aiding us?
Well, like I just want to say that there's only one growth industry in South Africa that I know of, and that's potholes. Sadly, it's a fact.
Now, isn't it tragic? Um, the one guy, when people complained about the potholes and so on, he said, man, when your grandfather came here, there wasn't even a road, and you moan about the pothole. But of course, it's very demoralizing to see good infrastructure crumbling down to nothing.
Well, the pothole situation kind of sums up what's going on in South Africa. You can actually measure South Africa's performance by the growth in potholes, because it's just a very visible sign that something is going terribly wrong.
Exactly. There's some other, I would almost say, poetical symbol of this whole thing. You know that a little bit less than a year ago, Parliament burned down. Now it's really tragic, and it's bad.
Yeah.
But they haven't started repairing anything yet, and there's still some of this perimeter tape, fencing it off that one can't enter. So you have this huge bust of ex-President Mandela in front of a building which is burned down. The black suit is still out of all the windows. All the curtains are in tatters as they burned. And there's even a South African flag on the pole, which is also in tatters because the heat reached that. So you have this bust, which should be one of the most proud, places in South Africa for the ANC. They took over this from the white government, and they really transformed into something, and now it's all burnt.
Well,
it's a little bit a symbol.
I just think that kind of sums up what they've done to South Africa. And just regarding Mandela, there's a museum in his hometown in Ugu, in the Transkei, the old Transkei. And that museum has now been closed for years because it wasn't maintained properly. And, it just shows that they don't care about their own history, let about pre-1994. They're just clueless.
Yes, I actually, there are things that I don't understand. And one of those is that which you said just now, and being on the parliamentary precinct, walking up and down past this burned down building. I would like to say, if I was in government and not in opposition, I would be so ashamed of this. I wouldn't be able to look at it on a daily basis.
Yeah. Now, we've got slightly off the topic because we're talking about food security. What would the social impact be in the worst case scenario, where a large percentage of the indigenous population really started starving, and you've got these big locations like Alexandria next to Sandton, for example? I mean, isn't that a powder keg?
General Jan Smuts had this expression which people very often quote without knowing it was him saying it. But he said, in South Africa, the best and the worst never happens. Now, I think most of us has given up hope on the best ever happening, but we try to think that maybe the worst won't happen either. On the one hand, if it really gets down to the point that the state can't hand out SASSA pensions anymore, or SASSA grants, there's basically now more than half of the population gets some kind of grant from the South African Social Security Agency. And that is really what stands between many people and starvation, are those SASSA grants. If that has to fall away for some reason, I don't know what will remain standing. It's very difficult to see that. in a certain sense, one has to try to salvage this whole story from two sides. On the one hand, you can't give up with government, with the state itself. There are many things that could improve with the state. Power could be devolved to the provinces or whatever. Accountability could be improved. There's still a lot of tax money coming in. I mean, in this present year, the tax man collected, I think, something like 48 billion rand more than he expected to do. So there are really good things happening. I'm on the portfolio committee for higher education, science and innovation. It's incredible how innovative people are, South Africans, and those are black and white. So there's always a thing about a plan. You know the story about the Boer maak 'n plan?
Yeah.
And then there's a story saying one of the other population groups, I'm a little bit scared to make a joke about any other population group than my own, but the response to that is, yes, but this other guy already has a plan, doesn't have to make one. So I think there's a certain level of resilience, and people will maybe realize that it's necessary to be, in a certain sense, more self-sufficient, using the land which is available, although it is very little. If one goes through a township and you see the number of goats and even cattle walking around, one realizes this is a part of the economy which is not recorded. Surely people eat some of these sheep sometimes, or some of these goats, and cows are milked. There's a huge informal economy, not recorded, and it keeps the country going. And that could be more efficient if people have more skills and more dedication to really instrumentalize the possibilities that they have. I'm a huge fan of an Australian concept, that of permaculture, with Bill Mollison, and I forgot the other guy's name who devised this. But it's in fact a little bit of common sense about food producing, which every family should be involved in. So I think we have to deal with this from both sides. We can't give up on the state. We can't say let it just crumble, because it can always get worse. But on the other hand, one would need to work from below, and say ordinary people like you and me and the other guy have to do what we can. And in the case of power generation, that is already happening. You know, all over the place you have these solar panel on rooftops.
Yeah.
Everyone to his own scale. If it's a house, maybe 5 or 6 or 14 panels. If it's a business, maybe a few hundred. If it's a mine, a huge amount, or a huge number of panels. But each one is saying, okay, I cannot save the whole country, but I can do something. And if I'm less dependent on the state, then the state have more resources to look after other persons. And especially communities come together and do this kind of thing. Micro networks evolving with renewable energy. I don't think anybody in his right mind would think that you can switch off coal one day and the next day, you switch on all the renewables. But this is a kind of a transition in which every little person in his own little life, like my own, try to make some rational decision.
Yeah.
And that's what will keep stuff going.
Yeah. Now, Wynand, I want to thank you so much for coming on tonight and giving us an update on what's going on in South Africa. And you obviously are close to the action, being a member of Parliament. And we've discussed 3 key issues. And I think the one about this, what's going on in the school, is something that Parliament really needs to keep an eye on, because this has clearly been influenced not by a local South African group, but by overseas groups who want to bring the country down. So Yeah, look, that's an area of huge concern. I'm going to hand over the floor to you just to wrap up and just deliver a message to people. And while you're doing that, or before you do that, I just want to remind people to register on our platform, which is lovinglifetv.com, which is absolutely exploding at the moment. There's a lot of good stuff happening there. Back to you, Wynand.
No, thank you, Scott. I really appreciate the opportunity to formulate some ideas and to discuss it with you, and even maybe to involve more people in the discussion. I'm an Afrikaner. We get our name from Africa. We are here. We are not going anywhere. Of course, there are always, one doesn't speak for everyone. But we need to make a success of this, and I think we need to, to learn to live without the South African identity as a primary identity, but to live within our communities. And that's an economic story, it's a cultural story, it's a social story, it's an educational story. To say we are not a colonial corner, far off corner of the world. To us, it's the center of our world. And the center of one's world is something to look after. And that's what we are doing.
Right. Wynand, thank you so much. And look, I've been keeping a close eye on Orania, and I think what they're doing there is just absolutely amazing. And that young fellow who heads up the Orania movement, I've just forgotten his name right now. Stratum, that's it, yeah. Amazing guy, doing a fantastic job. But look, great speaking to you, and we look forward to chatting to you probably in the new year.
Thank you very much, and say to Marlena, I'm sorry if I give her some, nervous moments by not quickly responding to emails and so on, but I really appreciate the effort, and yours, of course.
Fantastic. All right, mate, take care and have a great evening.
Thank you. Same to you. Okay. Goodbye.
Bye. All right, guys, that was Dr. Wynand Boshoff, and of course he's a senior member of the Freedom Front Plus. And look, it's always good to get different perspectives on things. Thanks to the moderators for looking after the side chat and keeping things in check there. And I'm going to go out tonight with, I think, Hier bly ek boer. Here we go.
Meer as 61,000 van ons voorvaders het op die grens vir ons gesterwe, sodat ons vry kan wees. Die is my land, die is my reg, hier is ek boer. Van stof is ek gemaak en sal ek terugkeer. Die Bybel is die woord waaruit ek leer, soos die grond op die aarde. Hier bly ek boer. Soos diep in die nacht sal die vyand kom, maar hier bly ek staan en ek draai nie om, want jy maak my nie bang nie. Hier bly ek boer. Die is my land waarvoor ek sal veg. Die is my bloed, my sweet, my reg. Die is die plek waar my voorvaders leef. Die is my land, hoor wat ek jou sê. Die is my land, wat my mense voor. Hier bly ek boer. Soos 'n blaadsem in die somer wat vreugde bring, my oupa wat Manikiro kon sing, soos hy stap deur die lande, hier was hy boer. My wortels lê diep in die grond geplant, my seun soos my pa los ek vir jou die land, en jy hoef nie te vrees nie. Hier sal jy boer. Die is my land waarvoor ek sal veg. Die is my bloed, my sweet, my reg. Die is die plek waar my voorvaders leef. Die is my land waar ek jou sê. Die is my land wat my mense voer. Hier bly ek voor. Die leeu sal kom, 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 die leeu sal kom. Die is my land waarvoor ek sal veg. En die is my bloed,